Drake just walked straight into the one trap he swore he'd never fall for again, and this time he brought the game with him. Two of the most stubborn names in hip-hop are quietly assembling a joint strike against Kendrick Lamar, and what they don't realize is that the entire plan was dead before the first beat ever loaded. The studio link-up. The orchestrated comment. The synchronized media machine spinning up like it's 2024 all over again. None of it is an attack. It's a surrender dressed up as an ambush. And by the end of this breakdown, you're going to see the exact sequence of the collapse before it happens, because this is not a prediction. This is an autopsy of a strategy that's already bleeding out on the table. But hold on, because before we open the vault on this disaster, I hope everybody out there is doing well. Happy Friday to all of you who are tapped in, and to the miserable crash-outs we're about to put under the microscope today. I hope your weekend gets better, because your strategy isn't going to. And you already know what to do. Hit that like button right now, and I mean really hit it, because we are about to send a message to every propagandist in this culture who thinks the audience can't see the strings. If you're new here, subscribe, because the next 2 weeks on this channel are going to be chaos. Now let's get into the mess, because what's unfolding between Drake, the game, and the shadow of Kendrick Lamar might be the most revealing moment of the entire post-beef era. Here's what brought us to this point. Earlier this week, a very specific comment appeared under a very specific post from a very specific internet loudmouth who just happens to carry water for the Toronto side of this Cold War every single time the machine needs a mouthpiece. And don't let anybody in your feed tell you that placement was organic. Nothing in this ecosystem is organic. That comment was a chess move. The game slid into those replies with a message dripping in coded language, talking about how at least one commentator finally understood what was really happening, how the fans of the loudest voices would never see the truth, how the people we think we know are not who we think they are, and he capped it off with a threat about pulling back the curtain and exposing every clown in the circus. Now read that again. Read it 10 times if you have to. Because that is not a comment. That is a positioning statement. That is the game announcing to the entire culture that he's shifting from silence into offense, and he's seeding the narrative in advance so the audience leans his direction before the music ever drops. This is playbook stuff. This is a rapper who watched The Last War and thinks he learned the lesson. And layered on top of that, we've now got reports swirling that the game and Drake were in the studio together this past weekend. Are the reports real? Maybe. Maybe not. This industry runs on smoke and misdirection, and a leaked studio session is one of the oldest rollout tricks in the book. It could be genuine. It could be an album teaser in disguise. It could be pure theater engineered to hijack a news cycle. But the truth of the session doesn't matter. What matters is the signal. What matters is what it's designed to do inside your head. And this is where we need to zoom out, because to understand why this move is catastrophic, you have to understand how the last war was actually lost. Drake did not lose to Kendrick Lamar because of bars. Drake lost because of narrative. When the Big Three framing was still standing, when Drake and J. Cole were hugging on records and building the myth of a shared throne, Kendrick walked in and refused to co-sign the ceremony. One verse. One refusal. He didn't position himself as one of three. He positioned himself as the one who broke the three. That wasn't anger. That was architecture. And from that moment forward, every exchange in that war happened on terrain Kendrick had already mapped. To his credit, he fired back with real ammunition. Family Matters had sharp flips. It had genuine counterpunches. From a pure boxing standpoint, he landed shots in that exchange. But the ground had already shifted under him, and he couldn't feel it moving because he believed his own gravity was stronger than the culture's memory. He believed his machine, his propaganda network, his global hit-making apparatus could reshape any narrative in real time. And he was wrong. Not Like Us didn't just win the battle. It rewrote the terms of how battles get judged. It turned a diss record into a stadium anthem, a Grammy sweep, a Super Bowl moment in front of over 100 million people. Kendrick didn't just beat Drake. He made the defeat a permanent cultural artifact. So you'd think, after absorbing the most public L in modern rap history, the Toronto camp would understand the mechanics of what happened to him. You'd think the lesson would be burned into the strategy room whiteboard. But everything we're seeing right now says the opposite. Because here is the fatal fracture running through this entire comeback plan, and I need you to lock in on this, because once you see it you can never unsee it. The single most valuable asset he has left from the previous war, the one storyline his camp has been carefully reloading for 18 months, is the gang-up defense. The argument that it took an army to bring him down. The claim that Kendrick never beat him one-on-one, that the pile-on from every rapper with a grudge distorted the outcome, that history got it wrong. That revisionist narrative is his only long-term play. It's the only seed of doubt his defenders can plant in future debates. And now he's about to set fire to it himself. Because if Drake and the game walk into this new cycle as a coordinated pair, they hand every future analyst the rebuttal in advance. They cannot cry coalition when they are the coalition. They cannot cry pile-on when they're the ones stacking the pile. They cannot cry manufactured narrative while manufacturing the narrative in broad daylight, through the same commentator pipeline, with the same synchronized timing. The audience sees it already. The comments are already saying it. Every time a Drake defender tries to invoke the gang-up defense from now on, somebody is going to quote this exact moment and bury the argument in real time. The damage here isn't just tactical. It's retroactive. It rewrites what Drake can even claim about the war he already lost. But wait, it gets worse, because the second fracture is bigger than the first. When Drake and the game publicly signal they're ready to engage, they are creating a permission structure they cannot revoke. They're aiming at Kendrick. They believe the whole game is Kendrick or nothing. But that's not how this arena works. The moment you telegraph your willingness to fight the West Coast machine, you are telegraphing your willingness to fight every single rapper adjacent to it. Every name that's been quietly stacking ammunition. Every artist looking for a career-defining lightning strike. Every hungry MC who's ever wanted a piece of a name as big as Drake's. Run the scenario with me. Drake and the game drop the joint record. The internet detonates. The commentators go into overdrive. Everybody holds their breath waiting for Kendrick to break cover. And Kendrick does nothing. Silence. Total, sovereign silence. And instead, J-Rock steps out of the shadows. Or ScHoolboy Q reloads for the first time in years. Or Doekiai aims the flamethrower. Or Vaughn, still glowing from the Joey Badass firefight, decides to make the pivot of his career. Any one of those names can inflict real, material damage on Drake and the game before Kendrick ever touches a pen. And once one of them steps up, Drake and the game are cornered. Ignore the challenger, and you concede the ground. Dodge the smoke, and you look like you were bluffing the whole time. So you engage. And the second you engage, the entire operation mutates into something you never designed. You're no longer hunting the king. You're bleeding against soldiers you never wanted to fight, while the audience watches the momentum drain out of the room. And even if they survive that skirmish, even if they scrape out a debatable win over a J-Rock or a ScHoolboy, they arrive at the Kendrick moment with visible scar tissue. Weakened. Scuffed. Already spent. And Kendrick simply declines to answer, because by then he won't need to. The audience will have already written the ending. If this pattern sounds familiar, it's because we've already watched it happen. Look at the Joey Badass campaign. Joey wanted Kendrick. Joey built an entire content cycle around baiting Kendrick into the arena. And Kendrick never showed. Vaughn stepped out of one wing. Dalit stepped out of the other. By the end of that cycle, Joey was fighting two wars he never asked for, and the culture had completely lost interest in the target he was chasing. Kendrick's silence became the loudest weapon in the room. His refusal to engage said more than any diss track could have. And Joey Badass, a legitimately elite lyricist, walked out of that cycle with less momentum than he walked in with. That is the exact pattern Drake and the game are about to reenact, except with brighter lights, higher stakes, and a much bigger audience watching the stumble. Now let me take you one layer deeper, because the true nightmare scenario for Drake and the game isn't J-Rock. It isn't ScHoolboy. The worst case scenario is that Baby Keem picks up the phone. Baby Keem in 2026 is not the underestimated little cousin anymore. He's coming off a world tour critics are already calling one of the defining runs of the decade. He just delivered an album that multiple publications have quietly penciled onto their year-end lists. His streaming footprint, his critical standing, his cultural weight are all pointing the same direction. Baby Keem has arrived, and he carries a bloodline advantage you cannot manufacture, backed by 2 years of proving he can stand on his own name. So picture it. The joint diss drops. The audience waits. Kendrick stays silent. And then Baby Keem answers. He cannot dodge that. He cannot claim the challenger is beneath him. He cannot argue Baby Keem doesn't belong on the stage. And he cannot lean on his usual global superstar leverage, because at this exact moment, Baby Keem's credibility with the culture is arguably stronger than Drake's own. That is a matchup Drake does not want. That is a matchup the game flat out cannot survive. That's a young lion who's been sharpening his teeth on the road for 18 months suddenly staring at the opening of a lifetime. The damage would be catastrophic, the fallout permanent, and Kendrick would never lift a finger. He'd let the young lion do the hunting, and the entire culture would be forced to admit the West Coast machine is deeper than one man. And let's stay on that machine for a second, because the depth chart is the part of this equation that never gets enough attention. When the Toronto side looks across the battlefield, they are not looking at one man. They are looking at a full roster, a complete infrastructure, a label ecosystem that has spent 2 years quietly developing shooters for exactly this kind of moment. Drake's side has commentator contracts and nostalgia. Kendrick's side has J-Rock, ScHoolboy Q, Doekiai, Ray Vaughn, Baby Keem, and a bench that keeps reloading. One side of this war built a media network. The other side built an army of actual rappers. And when a rap war breaks out, you want the army of rappers. That should not be a controversial statement, and yet somehow it is the one truth the Toronto strategy room refuses to write on the whiteboard. Think about what that asymmetry does to the psychology of the whole operation. The challengers have to win cleanly, quickly, and publicly, because every week of stalemate bleeds them. Kendrick's side has to do absolutely nothing. The home team doesn't chase the challengers around the parking lot. The home team sits in the building and lets the challengers burn gas driving in circles. That is the positional reality of 2026, and everything about this coordinated rollout suggests that neither Drake nor the game has fully accepted it. They are still playing the game as if momentum belongs to whoever talks the loudest. It doesn't. It belongs to whoever the audience has already crowned, and that crowning happened a long time ago, in front of the biggest audience the genre has ever assembled. And even in the least brutal timeline, even if Kendrick himself decides to step up, Drake and the game still lose. Because the king isn't going to write a one-on-one response. He's going to write the omnibus verse. The record where he addresses the entire coalition in a single verse, so cinematic, so surgical, so complete that the culture remembers it for the rest of the decade. Every name that aligned against him becomes a bar. Every mouthpiece that ran cover becomes a footnote. Every strategist who thought the pile-on would suffocate him becomes a case study. Kendrick will walk into a room where the whole industry expects him to drown, and he'll walk out having repainted the walls. That is the version of Kendrick you do not summon. And he, of all people on this planet, should already know that version exists, because that version ended him the first time. That's the version that dropped Not Like Us on a Friday and turned a diss into a global anthem by Sunday. That's the version that converted maximum pressure into maximum art. And now Drake and the game want to ring that doorbell voluntarily. That's not strategy. That's a seance run by two men who've convinced themselves they can control what walks through the door. And zoom out one more time, because the frame around this fight matters as much as the fight. Look at the horizon these two are walking into. You've got Kanye publicly campaigning for his own shot at the throne during a Super Bowl weekend meltdown. You've got Joey Badass fresh off a campaign that was supposed to crown him and instead fed him to two challengers he never wanted. You've got 50 Cent loitering at the edge of every interview, nudging the anti-West narrative forward one soundbite at a time. And now the Toronto camp and the game are lining up as the next entrants. From the audience's chair, that doesn't look like a rivalry. It looks like a queue. It looks like a waiting room full of legends holding numbered tickets, all hoping to be the one who finally lands the shot that sticks. And here is the brutal math of that queue: every name that steps up and fails makes the throne look higher. Every failed challenger is another brick in the champion's wall. The coalition these two think they're building isn't a battering ram. It's a construction crew, working around the clock to fortify the very legacy they're trying to crack. And ask the question nobody in their camp seems willing to ask out loud: what does winning even look like? Define the victory condition. Say the joint record drops and it's genuinely great, the best either of them has sounded in years. Say the bars land, the beats knock, the timeline erupts. Then what? The champion stays silent, the audience crowns the silence, and the record ages as a beautiful scream into an empty arena. Or the champion answers with the omnibus verse and the whole operation becomes the setup for somebody else's masterpiece. Or a lieutenant answers first and the whole thing dissolves into a sideshow. There is no branch of this decision tree where the challengers walk away taller than they walked in. Not one. I've run every branch, and the best-case scenario is a stalemate that the history books record as a loss, because stalemate against a silent king is a loss. When the house doesn't have to play, every hand you win still pays the house. And here's the deepest cut, the one every serious student of this culture needs to absorb. Drake and the game are operating on the assumption that they hold propaganda superiority. They believe that with the right commentator ecosystem, the right timeline coordination, the right roster of amplified voices, they can manufacture a unanimous public demand for Kendrick's engagement. Loud enough noise, forced enough consensus, and Kendrick either answers or looks weak for refusing. That assumption is the final fracture, because it fundamentally misreads where the culture is in 2026. Today's audience is media literate to a degree that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. They've watched propaganda cycles spin up in real time. They know the signatures. They can smell a coordinated push before the second post lands. Manufactured demand does not register as organic demand anymore. And on top of all that, the audience already delivered its verdict on the last war. No amount of retroactive commentary is going to sand that down. Which means the propaganda advantage they think they're holding is neutralized before launch. The noise campaign reads as noise, not consensus. Kendrick's silence reads as statesmanlike, not scared. A silent champion inside a manufactured storm looks like a man on a throne, and every day he refuses to engage is another day Drake and the game look more desperate for a response that isn't coming. And desperation, as anyone who's ever studied a battle up close will tell you, is the single most dangerous emotion a rapper can wear in public. Desperation is the tell. Desperation is the crack in the mask. Desperation is what turns a coordinated assault into a slapstick routine in front of an audience that already changed the channel. Now let me be clear about something before the misread machine spins up, because I know exactly how this analysis is going to get twisted by the people who need to twist it. This is not a fan argument wearing an analyst costume. I have people in my life who ride for Drake. I've sat across dinner tables debating this exact question for hours without a single raised voice, because this is the culture we all love and we can hold different verdicts without hating each other. I'm telling you this as somebody who studies sequence warfare for a living, somebody who has watched every major battle of the last 15 years frame by frame. From a pure strategic standpoint, the Operation Drake and the game appear to be executing will collapse under its own weight before Kendrick ever has to intervene. And I haven't even touched the collateral damage. I haven't touched what this does to the parallel storylines Drake's camp is managing behind the curtain. I haven't touched how this cycle interacts with the legal chess pieces still moving in the background of the previous war. I haven't touched what this does to the game's touring economics, his streaming leverage, his negotiating position for whatever deal comes next. Every domino in this ecosystem is standing in a very specific position right now, and this joint move has the potential to knock several of them over in ways neither of these men seem to have modeled. Some of those dynamics, I genuinely can't say out loud on this platform, because certain conversations don't survive the algorithm. But you can read between the lines. You can connect the dots. The shape of what I'm not saying tells you the shape of what I am. Let's talk about the game specifically for a moment, because this is where the analysis gets uncomfortable for his supporters. Nobody with functioning ears is going to tell you the game can't rap. The catalog spans generations. The man has lived through eras most of the current crop only read about. But every angle the game could realistically take against Kendrick has a mirror image reversal already waiting for it. Every attack line has a counter line. Every accusation has a preloaded refutation. Every biographical detail he might try to weaponize is sitting on the same public record that Kendrick's writers already have open on their laptops. And the game cannot say the reverse. That asymmetry is the death sentence of this entire operation. When one side has infinite ammunition and the other side has a single loaded chamber, the outcome isn't a debate. It's a countdown. And the ammunition problem deserves its own paragraph, because it's worse than it looks. What exactly is the attack line against the Compton champion in 2026? You cannot chart shame him, because he outcharted everyone while standing on the biggest stage in American sports. You cannot credibility shame him, because his credibility is the one currency that appreciated during the war while everyone else's inflated away. You cannot culture shame him, because the culture just spent 2 years treating his victory lap like a national holiday. Every door the game might try to kick in leads into a room where Kendrick has already rearranged the furniture. Meanwhile, the return fire writes itself. Every angle on the game is a matter of public record, 20 years of interviews, feuds, contradictions, and receipts, all time-stamped, all searchable, all waiting to be loaded into a verse by a writer who has already proven he can turn public record into platinum. This is not a fair fight. It is not even an unfair fight. It is a public demonstration of why you do not challenge the archivist when your whole life is in the archive. And the risk profile here is brutally uneven, which is why I keep saying this is a bigger mistake for the game than it is for Drake. Drake can absorb a loss and still headline stadiums. Drake has commercial insulation, a touring machine, a global platform that shrugs off bad cycles. The game has none of that. He is essentially staking his final major cultural moment on a strategy with a structural crack running down the middle of it, and if it collapses the way I believe it will, there's no clean recovery path. Drake loses this and keeps moving. The game loses this and the culture writes him out of the current conversation entirely. No serious strategist signs off on that risk profile. And yet here we are, watching it get executed in real time. One more variable nobody is modeling. The commentator ecosystem Drake and the game are leaning on is not as unified as they think. Certain podcasts have already pivoted from full-throated defense to careful neutrality. Certain influencers are already testing contrarian takes to gauge the temperature. That's what happens when a manufactured coalition starts sensing the product might not deliver. Mercenaries start shopping for their next contract before the current one goes bankrupt. By the time this joint record actually drops, the media army they're counting on may look very different than it does today. Watch how this plays out in slow motion, because it's the most predictable part of the entire sequence. Week 1, the ecosystem is unified, every voice on message, every timeline post hitting the same talking points within the same 4-hour window. Week 2, the first hairline cracks appear, a podcast host hedges a take, an influencer suddenly discovers nuance. Week 3, the pivot begins in earnest, because the audience response data is brutal and these people can read their own analytics better than they can read a room. By week 4, half the machine is covering the story as a Drake misstep instead of a Drake offensive, and the other half is quietly scrubbing their old posts. This is not speculation. This is the exact life cycle we watched during the last war, compressed and sped up, because the audience is faster now and the mercenaries are more experienced at abandoning ships. Drake and the game are planning a long siege with an army that has a documented history of deserting mid-battle. That is not a plan. That is a hope wearing a plan's clothes. And understand the verification economy we're living in now, because it's the silent force underneath everything I've described. The modern hip-hop audience doesn't just consume narratives. They audit them. They screenshot timestamps. They cross-reference posting schedules. They notice when 3 accounts with the same agenda publish within the same hour using the same vocabulary. The coordinated comment that kicked off this entire cycle was dissected within hours, not days, and the verdict in every neutral corner of the internet was the same: this is a setup, and we can see the strings. 10 years ago, that setup works. 5 years ago, it probably works. In 2026, the audience completes the forensic work before the strategists finish the rollout, and then the audit itself becomes the story. That's the nightmare version of virality, the one where the rollout goes viral as a case study in manipulation instead of as a campaign. Every hour that passes, the comment stops being a threat and starts being an exhibit. And exhibits don't scare champions. Exhibits get filed, timestamped, and read back to you later, at the worst possible moment, in front of the largest possible crowd. And one more layer on the silent strategy, because it connects directly to everything above. Kendrick's refusal to engage is not passivity. It is the most aggressive posture available to a reigning champion. Every diss record aimed at a silent king becomes a monologue. Every monologue becomes a confession. Every confession becomes content for the other side. The longer Drake and the game talk into the void, the more the void talks back, because the audience fills the silence with the only narrative that fits, which is that the king heard the noise, looked at the source, and went back to his throne. You cannot win an argument against a man who refuses to have it. You can only lose one. So stack every variable on the table and look at the picture that emerges. This is not two rappers preparing a successful counteroffensive. This is two rappers walking into a room where every exit is rigged, every ally is quietly scanning for the door, and every member of the audience has already decided how the story ends. Kendrick doesn't need to fire a shot. Kendrick doesn't need to write a bar. Kendrick just needs to keep breathing and let the calendar do the work. Every day of silence makes the noise on the other side louder, and the louder the noise gets, the more it confirms the exact story Kendrick has been silently telling for 18 months. That's the physics of this moment. That's the geometry of the collapse. Drake and the game are cooking a meal they won't be able to eat, and Kendrick is sitting at the head of the table, waiting to send it back to the kitchen. And consider the final wrinkle, the one that ties the whole noose. Drake's own commercial cycle is forcing his hand. Every album from here forward gets graded against the war. Every single that lands soft reads as proof the damage is permanent. Every feature that underperforms reads as proof the gravity shifted. And every attempt to reignite the beef through the game, through surrogates, through conveniently leaked studio rumors, reads as proof Drake cannot let go. That's the posture of a man haunted by a verse he couldn't answer, and the more he tries to answer it now, the more he confirms he couldn't answer it then. Meanwhile, Kendrick owes nobody anything. He doesn't owe Drake a verse. He doesn't owe the game a syllable. Silence from a defeated challenger looks like defeat. Silence from a reigning champion looks like a throne. And these two men do not appear to understand which side of that equation Kendrick is standing on. And here's the historical context that should terrify anyone planning this kind of operation. Hip-hop has a long memory for exactly one thing, and it is not bars. It is posture. The culture remembers who chased and who was chased. It remembers who needed the moment and who owned the moment. 20 years from now, the documentary about this era does not linger on streaming numbers or commentator spin. It lingers on the image of one man standing on a car at the Super Bowl while 130 million people watched, and it lingers on the image of the other camp still trying to relitigate the result 2 years later. Drake and the game are not just risking a battle loss. They are risking their placement in the permanent record of the culture. Every escalation from this point forward is an application to be cast as the villains of someone else's victory documentary. And the terrifying part, from their side of the table, is that the casting decision isn't made by Kendrick. It's made by the audience, in real time, in the comments, in the group chats, in the barbershops, one conversation at a time. That process is already underway. The studio reports and the coordinated comments didn't pause that process. They accelerated it. Now, because I believe in finishing the analysis instead of just pointing at the fire, let's talk about what the intelligent version of this looks like. If I'm sitting in the strategy room for either of these men, the advice is simple and brutal. Finish the album. Make the music undeniable. Let the work reopen the conversation instead of the rollout. The one thing that has ever actually moved the needle in his favor across his entire career is a record so big that the narrative has to chase it. Not a comment. Not a surrogate. Not a leaked studio photo with a strategically blurred tracklist. A record. And for the game, the play is even clearer, because his lane has never been the Cold War. His lane is the legacy run, the anniversary shows, the documentary storytelling, the veteran statesman position that this culture genuinely has open right now and that he is uniquely qualified to fill. There is a version of the next 2 years where the game becomes the elder voice of West Coast rap history and cashes that positioning for the rest of his career. And there is a version where he becomes the final footnote of a war that ended before he entered it. Those two versions diverge at exactly this decision point, at exactly this comment, at exactly this rumored studio session. That's what makes this moment so strange to watch from the outside. The wrong move and the right move are standing next to each other wearing almost the same outfit, and the only way to tell them apart is to understand the terrain. And the terrain, for the 100th time, is perception. It's narrative. It's the story the audience has already agreed to tell itself. That story was written 18 months ago. It has a hero, it has a crown, and it has a closing chapter that the culture has already read out loud together, in stadiums, in award show seats, in living rooms all over the world. You don't reopen a story like that with a comment section. You definitely don't reopen it as a two-man coalition with a synchronized media push. All you do is remind everybody why they loved the ending. So here's my verdict, delivered without a drop of fandom in either direction. Drake and the game are better off leaving this alone. Finish the albums. Run the tours. Build the legacies. Do not invite the Reaper back into your timeline, because every attempt to reopen the case reminds the audience of the original verdict. Every escalation hands Kendrick a fresh microphone. Every coordinated post reads more like a confession than an offensive. And every day without a response makes the silence look less like ducking and more like declining to swat a fly. Let me put the timeline on the record so nobody can say later that the warning didn't exist. Within days of any official announcement, the commentator split begins, and the first defections get noticed. Within weeks, the first West Coast response lands, and it will not come from the name they're aiming at. Within a month, the conversation has fully mutated from anticipation into audit, and every post in the campaign is being read as evidence instead of offense. And somewhere inside that window, the moment arrives that this entire operation was built to avoid, the moment where the audience looks at the two men making all the noise, looks at the one man making none, and renders the only verdict this culture has ever really cared about. The loud ones wanted it. The quiet one didn't need it. That verdict doesn't require a single bar from anybody. It just requires the calendar to keep turning, and the calendar has never once lost a battle. Now, before the final word, a word to the strategists watching this from inside the machine, because I know you're here. You're measuring sentiment right now. You're deciding whether the rollout survives contact with the timeline. So measure this: the audience isn't rejecting the music. Nobody has heard the music. The audience is rejecting the choreography. They can see the curtain, they can see the strings, and they can see the two men holding them, and in 2026 that visibility is fatal. The era of the invisible hand is over. The audience grew up, got literate, and started keeping receipts, and any campaign designed for the audience of 2016 is going to get dissected by the audience of 2026 in front of millions. That's not a threat from me. That's a weather report. The storm doesn't hate you. The storm just doesn't care about your rollout. And if they proceed anyway, if the record drops, if the cycle launches, remember the map I drew for you today. Remember the gang-up defense they built with their own hands. Remember the challenger they can't control. Remember Baby Keem. Remember the Omnibus Verse. Remember the propaganda ceiling and the commentator mercenaries. When the pieces start moving, you're going to watch this exact sequence unfold in real time, and you'll remember somebody laid it all out before the first bar was ever recorded. The pattern was visible. The outcome was predictable. And the men executing the operation walked in with their eyes open, because their arrogance convinced them the risks didn't apply. Now listen, before I let you go, I want to know where you stand on all of this, because this one is going to split the comments straight down the middle. Do you think the joint record ever actually drops, or is this all rollout theater? If Kendrick stays silent for 6 more months, does that read as strength to you, or does the pressure eventually force his hand? And if Baby Keem is the one who answers, does Drake even survive that conversation? Get in the comments and let me know, because I read every single one and the sharpest takes get a response. If you made it this far, you're built different, so do me one favor and hit that like button on the way out. Subscribe if you're new, because the next video digs into a connected sequence in this war that absolutely nobody is covering yet, and you do not want to walk into that one cold. To everybody who's been riding with the channel, thank you, genuinely. None of this exists without you showing up. The map is in your hands now. All that's left is watching the terrain confirm it. I'll see you on the next one.